Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the 5 greatest Schubert pianists. You know, Schubert pianists are kind of a new breed. It's something that a lot of people wouldn't have thought about just a few decades ago. You know, Schubert's piano music was, well, it was sort of a specialty repertoire. Now, of course, it's not, because there have been so many fine pianists who've explored it, and because we've discovered, actually, that it's an amazing body of work. Of course, the last sonata, Deutsch number 960, is the one that gets most of the attention. I mean, everybody hauls out that sucker, especially when they want to do something that makes them look profound and transcendental. That's all because of a trill, by the way. You know, the opening movement, you know, it has that wonderful opening theme. It's soft, it's quiet, and then there's a pause, and then the piano goes, it's like a little trill on the bottom. And oh, that little trill has engendered so much debate. Part of the debate is whether or not you do the exposition repeat, because the only loud time you hear the trill is if you do the exposition repeat. It's a big extra pile of music there. If you don't do the repeat, you lose the big extra pile of music there. And, oh, I've seen some vicious discussions, arguments, hysterical tirades about whether or not people should take exposition repeats. I personally don't care. If it's a great performance without the repeat, great. I'm happy with it. If it's a great performance with the repeat, so much the better. You get to hear the exposition twice. But really, Schubert's piano music is its own world. It's beautiful and sensitive and intimate and spiritual. It's got all of those qualities. It really does. And it does not require insane levels of virtuosity. It requires the kind of virtuosity that comes with intelligent thought, more or less. I mean, there are virtuoso moments. Of course, the Wanderer Fantasy, which Schubert himself couldn't play, is extremely virtuosic. There are moments, but by and large, it's not the technical monsters who dominate the field of Schubert piano music. So here is my list of the 5 greatest Schubert pianists, and I'm really curious to see yours, because like I said, it was a specialty repertoire when I was growing up, and then it became everybody's doing it, and it's very interesting, and some people did it really, really well. So first, there's Wilhelm Kempff. Kempff was, for many of us growing up in the 60s and 70s, the avatar of the German School of Music. His Beethoven was a reference edition, and his Schubert was a reference edition, and the Schubert probably even more than the Beethoven, because Schubert was less played than Beethoven. Everybody was doing Beethoven. Fewer people were doing Schubert, and fewer people were really investigating Schubert, you know, the full range of what Schubert did. And there's a lot of piano music. I mean, if you know your Schubert, you know, 20-something sonatas, not all of them are complete, but, you know, and then the smaller piano pieces. So it was a big deal to devote that much time and attention to Schubert. And Kempff was sort of the perfect guy for Schubert, because he wasn't the most demonstrative pianist, but he was a smart pianist. And he played the music with an effortlessness and an ease, which is really, really just lovely to hear. And it still is. It's held up very, very well over time. Next, Alfred Brendel. Now, I know some of you are going to point the finger and say, he hates Alfred Brendel. I don't hate Alfred Brendel. I never much cared for his tone. I think that he never much cared for his tone, to be honest with you. That was not sort of where he was at as a pianist, but he was an incredibly dedicated Schubert pianist, and I happen to think his Schubert sonatas are finer on the whole and more, well, what's the word, idiomatic than his Beethoven. You could argue that his Beethoven cycles, which he did over and over again, were a little bit, on the one hand, somewhat underplayed, and on the other hand, a little bit arch. And like I said, he didn't really respond to the heroic aspects of Beethoven. But Schubert doesn't really have heroic aspects. Schubert has romantic inward aspects, and Brendel could be very, very good at that. He didn't take exposition repeats. Well, that was somewhat controversial, but he recorded the major Schubert sonatas a couple of times, and they actually got better, which could not the case so much with his Beethoven. I think you could argue pretty convincingly. I find him to be a persuasive advocate of Schubert, and I've enjoyed his Schubert sonatas for a gazillion years. Really, really good stuff. So I'm happy to give Brendel kudos for being a superb Schubert exponent. He expones with the best of them. After Brendel, Radu Lupu. Now, Lupu is sort of the magic magician of pianists. He was a eccentric. He didn't like making records. He made very few of them, actually, and he had a very, very wide repertoire, but he didn't record all of it. And everybody knew from the very beginning when he did Schubert that it was something special. He was special. He treated the music as though it were special. Well, it is special music. It's very different from everything else. He seemed to operate from inside the music, and his Schubert recordings are really, really beautiful. Definitely terrific. They're on Decca, and he's one of the great Schubert guys. After Lupu, Mitsuko Uchida. She's wonderful, terrific pianist. She really is. She's an extremely sensitive and smart person. You could tell if you've ever seen her master classes and whatnot. She has this. She combines this real passion for the music with really sensible advice to her students, with really smart ideas about how to perform and interpret it. I like watching her, frankly. I really do. I like watching her teach. And her Schubert, at first it struck me as maybe a bit too effusive, a little bit too emotional, in the sense that there's an extra amount of rubato and sort of stretching and pulling, and she's willing to distort a phrase now and again. I found that particularly in the C minor sonata, the late C minor sonata, that when she approaches the second subject, she's a little arch, maybe. I don't know. But you cannot deny the exceptional feeling and sensitivity with which she approaches the music. And she's made Schubert one of the linchpins of her repertoire. And she's done so, I think, with considerable mastery. And she's one of the greats. No question about it. Last but not least. Oh, okay. You keep tossing him in. I keep not tossing him in. Sviatoslav Richter. And the reason he finally makes one of these lists is because he did enough. He did enough to really justify, being mentioned among the greats. I generally, I generally in this series limit my selections to pianists or artists who've devoted enough time and attention to the repertoire to amass a considerable body of work. Richter was one of those. He was a miracle as a pianist, but he did, what he wanted, when he wanted, bits here, bits there. There was so little about his work that was systematic and consistent, because he didn't care what kind of piano he played. He didn't care where he was. He didn't care about sound. He didn't, he was just, this force of nature that, sort of blew through the keyboard universe. But his Schubert was really special. He was notorious for some excruciatingly slow tempos. Oh, my God. They just went on forever, seemingly. And they were hypnotic, but he was able to sustain the tension throughout these entire long, somewhat discursive expositions that Schubert was wont to write. His ability to get us to believe that this was the most extraordinary music in the world, and that however long it was going to take, it was worth every second of our time. He was that kind of artist. He was mesmerizing, and he could really sort of galvanize our attention, and he devoted a tremendous amount of his time and virtuosity in his case, this sort of art that conceals art, I think, to Schubert. And he persuaded us, and he persuaded these succeeding generations of pianists, even if they didn't imitate him, that Schubert was a composer whose piano music was worthy of the highest gifts of keyboard wizardry. So Richter has got to be on any list, and that's my 5. I'm very interested to see what your 5 is, because I could think of a bunch of other pianists who could very, very easily be on a list. I mean, there's Murray Pariah, there's half a dozen I could probably come up with, and no doubt you could too. There are people who've done complete cycles of the music now. It's no longer a rarity, which means that the list of names, I think, is going to only grow over time and become even more interesting and rewarding for all of you out there to explore. So thank you for your contributions in advance. But I would ask you, just list 5. We don't need an essay. I mean, I've seen some people, when I did the Wagner conductors, Wagner got such long, tedious essays. They're like Wagner's long, tedious operas. My goodness! People wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Right? No. We're just talking about a simple list with a sentence or two. If you want to comment, that's okay. That's all we need. That's really, really all we need. We don't need a disquisition. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.